He was a billionaire CEO, a cold and calculating person who always had everything under control. But one day, something happened that not even he could control. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Elias Vance, a name synonymous with ruthless efficiency and unparalleled success, sat in the cavernous expanse of his penthouse office. The glass walls offered a dizzying panorama of the city below, a sprawling metropolis that he, in many ways, commanded. The space itself was a testament to his curated life, minimalist, sleek, and utterly devoid of personal clutter. Every object, from the ergonomic Italian leather chair to the abstract sculpture in the corner, was an exercise in calculated precision. It was here, in this perfectly controlled environment, that Elias felt most alive. He was a conductor, and the city was his orchestra. Right now, his symphony was a high-stakes corporate acquisition. The deal, codenamed Project Titan, would see Vance Industries absorb its closest rival, cementing Elias's legacy as a titan of industry. The stakes were astronomical, and the final negotiations were a delicate ballet of power and deception. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, scanned a spreadsheet projected onto a wall of glass, each number a variable in a complex equation of capital and influence. He was in the zone, a state of hyperfocus where the world outside faded into a blurry, inconsequential hum. The only sounds were the soft clack of his keyboard and the low thrum of the city's heartbeat. A subtle chime from his desk phone cut through the silence. Elias's hand, mid-keystroke, froze. It wasn't the usual line, it was a private number, reserved for a select few. The most frequent caller was his mother's nurse. He let out a barely perceptible sigh of annoyance. His relationship with his mother, Margaret, was a thing of polite formalities and scheduled phone calls. He loved her, he knew that much, but their connection was an abstract concept, a duty fulfilled rather than a bond nurtured. He picked up the receiver. Elias, a shaky voice, belonging to Nurse Jenkins, filled his ear. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but it's Mrs. Vance. She's had a fall." The words landed like a physical blow. Project Titan, the city outside, his carefully constructed world, all of it shattered. Elias's mind, a finely tuned machine, instantly reconfigured. "How bad?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "She's conscious, Mr. Vance. We don't believe anything is broken. But she's very shaken, and she's refusing our help. She won't let anyone touch her." Nurse Jenkins's voice was tight with stress, a testament to Margaret's notorious stubbornness. Elias ended the call without another word. The spreadsheet on the wall vanished, replaced by the blank cityscape. He strode from the office, his expensive shoes echoing on the polished floor. The journey to the Vance family estate was a blur. His custom-built car tore through the city streets, a black streak of urgency. His thoughts raced, a jumbled mess of concern, frustration, and a deep-seated guilt. He knew he hadn't been there for her. Their connection was a fragile, gossamer thread, and in moments like this, he was terrified it might snap. The family estate, a sprawling Tudor mansion nestled on acres of manicured grounds, was a world away from his sterile penthouse. As he pulled into the long, winding driveway, he saw a flurry of activity. The staff, from the groundskeepers to the head housekeeper, stood in a huddle near the front door, their faces a mix of concern and chaos. This was the Vance household in disarray, a sight Elias loathed. He was a man who demanded order, and this was anything but. He slammed the car door shut and stormed into the house. The grand foyer, usually a picture of silent elegance, was a hotbed of whispered panic. He ignored the staff's attempts to explain, his focus singular, his mother. He found her in the sunroom, a space filled with a riot of blooming orchids and rich, old-world furniture. The source of the fall, a stray footstool, lay overturned on the Persian rug. But it was the scene before him that made him stop dead in his tracks. Margaret was not on the floor. She was half-standing, her face a mask of pain and pride. But she wasn't alone. A woman, whom Elias didn't recognize, was helping her. The woman was dressed in a simple, dark blue uniform, the kind worn by the cleaning staff. She was black, with her hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her face held a quiet dignity that was instantly arresting. She wasn't fussing or panicking like the others. Her movements were deliberate, and her hands were gentle yet firm as she supported Margaret's weight. Elias watched, frozen in the doorway. He saw his mother, a woman who had once chaired charity galas and held court at society dinners, wincing with pain but accepting this woman's touch. The nurse and a maid stood by, wringing their hands, offering unheeded advice. But the cleaning woman, Lena, seemed to have an unspoken understanding with Margaret. She spoke in a low, soothing voice that Elias couldn't quite hear, but whose tone was calming and steady. "Slowly now, Mrs. Vance," Lena said, her voice a soft melody in the cacophony of the sunroom. "Just one more step. That's it. You're doing so well." Elias had never seen anyone handle his mother with such delicate grace. She was a woman who resisted help from everyone, a fortress of independence. Yet here she was, leaning on the arm of a woman she likely only knew as the cleaner. Lena didn't treat Margaret like a frail old woman or a difficult patient. She treated her like a person, with respect for her pain and her pride. There was a genuine, non-transactional care in her touch that was a world away from the professional detachment of the nurses or the nervous incompetence of the other staff. Lena's presence was an anchor in the storm, a single point of calm in a room filled with chaos. Elias's mind, always so quick to analyze and strategize, was strangely blank. He wasn't thinking about the fall, or the deal, or the staff's inefficiency. He was just watching Lena. Her eyes, filled with a deep, empathic warmth, met his for a brief moment as she guided Margaret to a nearby armchair. There was no fear in her gaze, no subservience. Only a quiet, resolute compassion. Margaret finally settled into the armchair with a sigh of relief, leaning heavily against the cushions. She looked up at Elias, her face pale but her eyes still flashing with her old fire. "Elias," she said, her voice a little weak. "Where have you been?" Elias, still captivated by Lena, barely heard her. His entire worldview, built on the foundations of cold logic and calculated self-interest, had just been shaken to its core by a woman who cleaned floors for a living and, in a moment of crisis, had offered a kindness that no one else had been capable of. He knew, with a certainty that was both unsettling and profound, that the life he thought he understood had just been irrevocably changed. The aftermath of Margaret's fall was a whirlwind of Elias's signature efficiency. Within an hour of her returning to her room, he had the nurse and 2 aides dismissed, their panicked incompetence a stain on the immaculate order he demanded. He replaced them with a new, highly recommended team, professionals whose resumes were as polished and unblemished as his own. His mother, he reasoned, deserved the best, and the best was quantifiable. Impeccable credentials, a sterile bedside manner, and a healthy dose of professional distance. Yet, a single variable remained in his equation of control. Lena. He'd seen her briefly, a quiet anchor in the storm of the sunroom, and the image of her steady hands supporting his mother was seared into his mind. It was an anomaly. Elias Vance operated in a world of motives and transactions. People acted in their own self-interest. A subordinate's kindness was either a bid for promotion or a calculated act to gain favor. But Lena's compassion had felt authentic. And that, to Elias, was a red flag. It was illogical. It was a risk. He couldn't trust something he couldn't explain. He couldn't, however, deny the effect she'd had on his mother. Margaret had accepted Lena's help, a feat no one else had accomplished. The new nurses, despite their training, struggled to bridge the chasm of his mother's stubborn pride. They were professionals, and she was their patient. There was no personal connection. So, Elias decided to keep Lena on the staff, but he would not do so blindly. From his penthouse office, miles away from the sprawling estate, Elias commanded a web of high-tech surveillance. The property was already equipped with an advanced security system, and with a few keystrokes, he rerouted the cameras from the sunroom and Margaret's main living area to a dedicated, encrypted feed. He wasn't watching to catch a thief. He was conducting an experiment. He would observe Lena. He would find the flaw, the motive, the crack in the facade of her kindness. For the first few days, his observations were sporadic, squeezed between multi-million-dollar calls and board meetings. He'd pull up the feed, his eyes scanning for a telltale sign of deceit. But what he saw was a methodical, quiet rhythm. Lena would arrive early, her uniform pressed and clean. She would move through the rooms with a near-silent efficiency, dusting the antique furniture, polishing the wood, and leaving no trace of her presence except for a faint, clean scent. But her duties as a cleaner were only half of her role. When she entered Margaret's personal space, she transformed. She wasn't an employee performing a task. She was a presence. One morning, Elias watched as Lena saw Margaret staring wistfully out the window at the now-frozen rose bushes she could no longer tend. Without a word, Lena knelt beside her chair and began to describe the simple, everyday life happening in the garden. She spoke of the robins pecking at the ground, the way the light caught the ice on the branches, and the promise of spring buried beneath the soil. She painted a picture with her words, bringing the world back to his mother's reach. Margaret didn't say much, but a small, genuine smile played on her lips. Elias, watching from his sterile office, felt a strange pang in his chest. He hadn't spoken to his mother about something so simple, so personal in years. He found himself watching the feed more and more. The deal with Project Titan, once the sole focus of his existence, began to feel hollow and distant. He was no longer looking for a flaw. He was watching, mesmerized, as an unexpected relationship blossomed. He saw Lena bring Margaret a cup of chamomile tea, prepared exactly as she liked it, without ever being asked. He saw her quietly adjust the pillows behind Margaret's back, making her more comfortable. He saw her find a book of old poetry, a collection Margaret had treasured, and read aloud from it in a clear, melodic voice. The poems, with their verses of love and nature, were a world away from the spreadsheets and stock reports Elias lived by. He also started to notice the subtle, almost imperceptible changes in his mother. The lines of pain around her eyes softened. The look of perpetual loneliness that he had learned to ignore was replaced with a kind of quiet contentment. She would ask Lena questions about her life, and Lena would answer with a dignified reserve, never complaining, always finding a way to share a small, hopeful story about her family or her dreams. Elias began to see a side of his mother he had never known, a vulnerable, curious woman who craved human connection beyond the dutiful obligations of her son. The internal conflict within Elias became a constant, gnawing presence. He was a man of action, a man who solved problems with money and power. But here, money was irrelevant. Lena was not asking for a raise. She wasn't seeking his approval. Her kindness was a pure, unfiltered force that defied his understanding. He felt a growing sense of shame as he watched from behind his digital curtain. He was a voyeur, spying on a genuine, tender connection, a connection he had been too busy, too detached, and too proud to forge himself. The cameras, initially his instruments of control, had become a mirror, reflecting his own emotional bankruptcy. One afternoon, the camera showed Lena folding a blanket. As she did, she found a small, embroidered handkerchief nestled within. Margaret's eyes lit up. "My mother made that for me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Lena didn't just hand it back. She sat down and listened as Margaret recounted stories of her childhood, her mother's deft hands, and the little acts of love that were woven into the fabric of their lives. For over an hour, they sat together, and for the first time, Elias truly saw his mother not as a duty, but as a person with a rich history and a heart full of memories. When Elias finally shut off the monitor that evening, the silent room felt heavier than usual. The numbers on his spreadsheets seemed meaningless. The power he wielded felt hollow. He had spent his life building a fortress of wealth and influence, but he had failed to build a single bridge to the people who mattered most. He had set out to find a flaw in Lena's character and had, instead, discovered the gaping holes in his own. He was no closer to understanding her, but he was light years closer to understanding his mother, and more disturbingly himself. The experiment was over, but the questions it raised were just beginning. The days that followed were a testament to the strange new rhythm Elias Vance's life had taken. His high-tech office, once a sanctuary of pure, unadulterated capitalism, now served as a reluctant observatory. The camera feeds, no longer tools of suspicion, had become a window into a world he had long been shut out of. He found himself stealing glances at the screen, watching as Lena moved through the estate with a grace that was both professional and deeply personal. He wasn't looking for her to slip up. He was, to his own quiet astonishment, watching to see what beautiful human act she might perform next. The peaceful routine they had settled into, Lena tending to the house and to Margaret, Elias watching from afar, was a fragile, delicate balance, a quiet before a storm. The storm came in the form of a priceless antique vase. It stood in the center of the library, a delicate Ming Dynasty piece that had been in the Vance family for generations. It was a symbol of their history, their wealth, and their enduring legacy, a testament to a world Elias had been born into, and a world he fiercely protected. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, Margaret was attempting to reach for a book on a high shelf, a task she should have asked for help with. In a moment of stubborn independence, she stretched a little too far, her hand catching the corner of the small table the vase rested on. The vase wobbled, an eternity of silent horror passing before it toppled, hitting the marble floor with a sound that was a sharp, final crack. The noise ripped through the otherwise silent house like a gunshot. It was a sound that announced disaster, and it sent a ripple of pure, unadulterated panic through the staff. The housekeeper, 2 maids, and one of the new nurses rushed into the room, their faces ashen. They didn't look at Margaret to see if she was hurt. They looked at the shattered remains of the vase on the floor, their eyes wide with fear. The vase wasn't just an object. It was a representation of Elias Vance's temper, a physical manifestation of his power. They knew that a priceless, irreplaceable object had been destroyed, and they were the ones who would have to face the fallout. Whispers of "he's going to be furious," and "what will he say?" filled the air. Lena was in the room, polishing a bookshelf, when the incident occurred. She didn't move as quickly as the others, but her presence was a stark contrast to their frenzied anxiety. She didn't look at the shattered pieces of porcelain. She looked at Margaret. Margaret's face was a mask of shame and fear, her knuckles white as she gripped the arm of her chair. It was the face of a woman who had just made a terrible, costly mistake, and who was now braced for the reprimand. Lena's movements were deliberate and calm. She knelt not next to the mess, but next to Margaret's chair. Her voice was a low, soothing murmur that cut through the staff's panicked chatter. "Are you all right, Mrs. Vance? You didn't hurt yourself, did you?" she asked, her eyes searching for any sign of injury. Margaret, still shaken, simply shook her head. Lena offered her a small, compassionate smile. "That's what's most important," she said softly, her gaze returning to the floor. The staff, meanwhile, stood frozen, their eyes darting from the vase to Elias's still-closed office door, terrified of the impending storm. Elias, watching the entire scene unfold on his monitor, felt a primal surge of anger. That vase, it was an icon. The sheer carelessness of it infuriated him. He was a man who valued precision, control, and assets. The vase was an asset, and it had been carelessly destroyed. He was about to reach for the intercom, to demand an explanation, to unleash the full force of his icy fury when he saw Lena's reaction. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't worried about the vase. She was worried about his mother. He saw the genuine, focused concern in her eyes. It was a complete departure from the fear that radiated off every other member of the staff. He watched as she retrieved a dustpan and a soft brush, and with a quiet dignity began to sweep up the shards. She worked with a reverence that was entirely unmerited for what was now a pile of trash. "I remember breaking a vase when I was a little girl," Lena said, her voice carrying an easy, conversational tone that seemed to defy the tension in the room. "My grandmother's favorite vase. It was her prized possession." Margaret, still looking mortified, mumbled, "I'm so sorry, Lena." Lena smiled gently, continuing her story as she worked. "Oh no, Mrs. Vance. My grandmother wasn't angry. She just sat me down and told me that everything in this world can be replaced, except for people. She told me that vases and heirlooms and old things were just that, things. They were a part of our past, but we are the keepers of the future. She said that a broken vase could be swept away, but a broken spirit was much harder to fix, and that what mattered most was a person's heart, not the value of their possessions." The words, so simple and yet so profound, landed with the weight of a hammer blow on Elias. He was sitting in an office surrounded by things that were a monument to his wealth and power. He had built his life on the value of possessions and assets. And here was a cleaning woman, a woman with nothing, who was teaching his mother, and by extension, him, a lesson about what truly mattered. His anger, which had been a hot, fiery presence a moment ago, dissolved into a cold, profound shame. He saw the staff's terrified faces, and he realized their fear was a reflection of him. He was the man who had created an environment where an old woman's health was secondary to a broken object. He had built an empire, but he had built it on a foundation of fear, not respect. Lena, meanwhile, finished her work. The shards were gone, the floor was clean. The other staff members, their panic now subdued, slowly drifted out of the room, leaving Lena alone with Margaret. Lena simply patted Margaret's hand, a small, comforting gesture that spoke volumes. The vase was gone, and no one would mention it again. But Elias, watching from his gilded cage, knew that the real damage wasn't to the porcelain, it was to his own perception of the world. Lena hadn't just cleaned up a mess. She had, with a simple story and a compassionate touch, exposed the hollowness of his own values. The experiment of observation was over. The lesson, however, was just beginning. The shattered remains of the Ming Dynasty vase had been swept away, but the emotional debris of the moment lingered. Elias Vance, the architect of a multinational empire, found himself standing on a new and unfamiliar foundation. Lena's words, her grandmother's wisdom about the irreplaceability of people, had not just humbled him. They had fundamentally reordered his priorities. He could no longer hide behind the clinical distance of a security camera. He was compelled to seek out the source of this profound perspective, to speak with Lena face to face. It was a terrifying prospect for a man who had perfected the art of the transaction. He knew how to command, how to negotiate, how to acquire. He had no idea how to simply talk. He chose a quiet afternoon for their meeting, a time when the new nurses were busy with Margaret's physical therapy and the rest of the staff was occupied with their duties. He sent a brief, formal request through the housekeeper, asking Lena to meet him in the small study off the library. It was the least intimidating room in the estate, a space filled with worn leather armchairs and walls lined with classic literature. A room that felt more like a sanctuary than a command center. Elias arrived first. He sat in a large, uncomfortable-looking chair, his posture rigid and his mind racing. He was preparing for this meeting as if it were a merger negotiation, running through a list of potential questions, trying to anticipate her answers. His palms were uncharacteristically sweaty. He was a master of a battlefield he knew intimately, but this was a new, emotional terrain, and he was completely unarmed. When Lena arrived, she knocked once, quietly, and entered without fanfare. She was dressed in her work uniform, her face serene and composed. She was not intimidated by him, and that fact alone disarmed him more than any strategic move she could have made. "Thank you for coming," Elias said, his voice sounding stilted and far too loud in the quiet room. "Of course, Mr. Vance," she replied, her voice soft but steady. She didn't sit down. She simply stood, a picture of quiet dignity, waiting for him to begin. Elias fumbled for a starting point. I wanted to thank you for what you did yesterday. With my mother. With the vase." The words felt inadequate and clumsy. Lena's expression remained unchanged. Mrs. Vance was upset. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Elias said, a little more emphatically than he intended. "They didn't. You saw her, not the vase. They saw the vase, not her." He paused, taking a deep breath and forcing himself to be direct. "I've been observing. I see the way you interact with my mother. You see things about her that I, her son, have never noticed. Her love of gardening, for example." Lena's gaze softened. She finally sat down in the chair opposite him, a silent invitation to speak on a more human level. She loves her garden. She keeps a collection of old seed packets and gardening books in her bedside table. The pages are worn from being turned over and over. She talks about the smell of the earth and the way the colors change with the seasons. She's a poet about her garden, Mr. Vance. Elias felt a sharp pang of regret. He had sent his mother flowers every month for a decade. He had bought her expensive art and jewelry. He had done everything a dutiful son was supposed to do, but he had never once thought to simply ask her what brought her joy. He knew the value of his company's assets down to the last cent, but he didn't know the true value of his mother's heart. "You're the first person she's ever opened up to about that," he said, the admission a quiet, painful confession. "I think she just needed someone to listen," Lena said simply. "We're often so busy with our tasks and our jobs that we forget the most important one is just to listen to one another." Elias was struck by the simple, profound truth of her words. He had always been a man who dictated, not listened. "What else?" he asked, his voice now a low, sincere query. "What else do you know about her that I don't?" Lena spent the next 20 minutes painting a picture of Margaret that was vibrant, detailed, and utterly foreign to Elias. She spoke of his mother's love for old black and white films, her fondness for a specific brand of ginger snaps, her quiet sadness on days when the rain kept her indoors. She spoke not of a patient or a project, but of a whole person, a woman with a rich, full inner life. By the end of the conversation, Elias felt both a deep gratitude for Lena and a profound shame for his own ignorance. He had been a billionaire CEO, but he had failed at the most important role of his life. The conversation shifted organically when Elias, humbled and disarmed, found himself asking about Lena. "And what about you, Lena? What do you do when you're not here?" Lena was hesitant for a moment, but then her face lit up with a quiet ambition. "I have a dream," she said, her voice filled with a passion that was a stark contrast to her usual serene tone. "I want to start a business. A small cleaning service, but different. I want to build a company that doesn't just clean houses, it takes care of people. A company that pays women a dignified wage, treats them with respect, and gives them the tools and the support to build a life for themselves. I want to build a business that is founded on the same principles as a good home: care, respect, and a belief that everyone deserves to feel valued. Elias, the corporate titan, listened in stunned silence. This was not a business plan for profit maximization. This was a vision born of empathy, a blueprint for human dignity. She wasn't talking about market share. She was talking about empowering people. He had spent his life building a fortress of wealth. Lena, he realized, was talking about building a community of support. I call it Lena's helping hands, she said with a hopeful, self-deprecating smile. I'm still saving up, but I believe in it. Elias felt a rush of emotions: respect, admiration, and a profound sense of awe. Lena was a visionary, not of commerce, but of humanity. She saw a need in the world, and she was determined to fill it, not for profit, but for purpose. He sat there, a man who could change the world with a single phone call, listening to a woman whose dream was a world away from his own, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that her vision was more powerful, more meaningful, and more important than anything he had ever built. The echoes of the conversation with Lena resonated deeply within Elias Vance. Her words had been a gentle, persistent rain on the hardened ground of his soul. He had asked about his mother and learned a lifetime of forgotten joys. He had asked about Lena and discovered a woman with a vision so pure and selfless it made his own empire feel like a hollow monument. Of all the revelations, however, the most poignant was the image of Margaret poring over her gardening books, dreaming of a world her body could no longer access. This, Elias decided, was something he could fix. This was a problem he could solve. He spent the rest of the day not in meetings, but on the phone with his top architects and landscape designers. He was uncharacteristically specific and urgent. "I need a garden," he commanded, his voice devoid of its usual clinical tone. "It needs to be immediately accessible from the sunroom. Raised beds, paved, flat walkways, a place for her to sit in the sun, a place she can use her hands." The designers, used to grand, abstract commissions, were taken aback by the personal, almost feverish detail of his requests. He didn't just want a garden. He wanted to resurrect a piece of his mother's soul. The next morning, he arrived at the estate before dawn, a time he usually reserved for reviewing spreadsheets and market reports. He found Lena in the kitchen, preparing coffee for the staff. He had intended to have a formal meeting, but seeing her there, in the quiet intimacy of the early morning, changed his mind. "Lena," he began, his tone less commanding than it had ever been, "I'm starting the garden project. I've commissioned the best team in the city, but I need your help." Lena looked up from the coffee pot, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "My help, Mr. Vance?" "Yes. You know what she needs. You know what would make her happy. My team knows plants and construction. You know my mother. I need you to be the project lead, the consultant." Lena's expression softened into a warm, gentle smile. "I would be honored." And so began an unlikely collaboration. Elias, the master of logistics and capital, and Lena, the master of empathy and human connection. They met in the sunroom, looking out at the neglected patch of lawn that was soon to be transformed. Elias presented blueprints and technical drawings, his finger tracing lines of drainage and irrigation systems. Lena listened patiently, then gently placed a hand on the drawing. "This looks beautiful," she said, "but the beds are too high. Margaret's hands are not as steady as they once were. She'll need to be able to sit and work comfortably. And this bench," she pointed to a spot on the plan, "is too far from the sun. She loves to feel the warmth on her face." Elias, who had never considered such details, was humbled. He realized he was trying to build a monument, while Lena was trying to build a space for joy. He found her suggestions invaluable. Her insights into his own mother's needs a constant source of quiet wonder. He saw a project not as a series of tasks, but as an act of love, guided by Lena's quiet wisdom. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. The sounds of construction filled a corner of the estate, a stark contrast to the usual hushed tones of the Vance household. Elias was there every day, not in a suit, but in work boots, watching the transformation. He and Lena would stand together, a peculiar pair, watching as the raised beds took shape and the accessible pathways were laid down. One afternoon, a cold wind whipped across the grounds, a foretaste of winter. Elias, bundled in a heavy coat, watched Lena as she stood by a newly built flower bed. He was struck by a thought he couldn't push away. a need to finally articulate the pain he'd carried for so long. "My father," he began, his voice low and strained. "He was the one who was good with her. He was the gentle one. After he died, I felt like I had to become the fortress, the provider, the cold, hard wall that protected everything." Lena turned to him, her eyes filled with a compassion that melted his carefully constructed facade. "She missed him so much," she said softly. "But she missed you too, Elias. She missed the boy who used to bring her wildflowers, not the man who sent her roses from a florist." He felt a hot sting behind his eyes. He had been so proud of his transactional love, of his ability to provide, that he had forgotten how to simply be present. "I'm terrified," he confessed, the words a raw, unfiltered admission of his deepest fear. "I'm terrified that I'll lose her, and all she'll remember is the CEO, not the son, that it's too late to fix this." Lena moved closer to him, her presence a source of warmth in the cold afternoon air. She didn't offer a platitude. She just listened, her silence a profound invitation for him to speak his truth. When he was done, she placed a hand on his arm, a simple, comforting gesture that bridged the chasm of their different worlds. "It's never too late, Elias," she said, her voice a balm to his aching heart. "The fact that you're building this garden, that you're here, talking to me, that tells me you're trying. And to a mother, there is no greater gift than a son who tries." She looked at the fledgling garden, its barren beds waiting for life. "This garden is not just for her. It's for you. It's a promise, Elias. A promise that you're going to be here, in the sun with her." Elias said nothing. He just stood there, the full weight of her words sinking in. The garden, once a simple project, was now a symbol of his redemption. Lena had seen past the billionaire and the fortress he had built, and she had seen a scared little boy who was just trying to find his way back home. The garden was almost complete, and with every plant and every paved stone, Elias felt the cold walls around his heart slowly, finally, begin to crumble. The garden, a verdant testament to a son's newfound purpose, was nearly complete. Paved walkways wound through neat rows of raised beds, and a comfortable bench sat in the sunniest spot, just as Lena had recommended. Margaret, now spending her afternoons there, was visibly more content. The project had done more than revitalize a neglected patch of ground. It had breathed new life into Elias Vance's relationship with his mother, offering them a shared purpose beyond the stale formalities they had once maintained. The cold walls around Elias's heart were crumbling, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning hope. But life, as Elias was learning, was not a perfectly executed project. It was messy, unpredictable, and entirely beyond his control. The call came late one evening. Elias, just back in his penthouse, felt a familiar and unwelcome dread as he answered the phone. It was one of the new nurses, her voice trembling with barely suppressed panic. Margaret had had a sudden, alarming dizzy spell. She had collapsed, and they were calling an ambulance. The world Elias had been so carefully rebuilding shattered in an instant. The garden, Lena's wisdom, his own fragile progress. All of it faded into the terrifying reality of a medical emergency. The man who commanded boardrooms with an icy calm now felt a cold, shaking fear gripping his insides. He drove to the hospital in a frenzied blur, his mind a chaotic mess of worst-case scenarios. The hospital, a gleaming monolith of polished floors and hushed voices, felt like a cold, impersonal fortress designed to keep him out. He found the nurses and medics in the emergency room, their faces grim but efficient. His mother was being attended to, surrounded by the sterile, beeping machinery of modern medicine. He stood by the doorway, a billionaire CEO reduced to a powerless bystander, his wealth and influence entirely useless in this stark, unforgiving environment. He watched as his mother, frail and small in the immense hospital bed, looked at him with an expression that was a heartbreaking mix of fear and pain. He tried to go to her, to offer comfort, but the nurses intercepted him, their voices soft but firm. "We need to run some tests, Mr. Vance. Please wait in the lounge." He was a number, not a person, and his position in the world meant nothing here. He sat in the cold, antiseptic waiting room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, his phone a useless object in his hand. He was a man accustomed to having an answer for everything, but for this, he had nothing. An hour later, as he stared blankly at a television screen showing a silent news report, a quiet presence entered the room. It was Lena. She was still in her uniform, a testament to her hasty journey from the estate. She didn't say a word to him. She just saw him, a man teetering on the edge of a panic he couldn't control. Without asking, she sat in the chair beside him, her presence a silent, profound comfort. "Is she all right?" she finally asked, her voice a low, steady anchor. Elias shook his head, unable to speak. "They don't know yet," he managed to choke out. Lena simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the sterile waiting room. She didn't offer him platitudes or false hope. She just sat with him, a quiet, reassuring presence in a world that had become unbearably loud and frightening. When the nurse finally called them, they went to Margaret's room together. Elias's mother was settled now, the initial panic of the emergency subsiding into a quiet exhaustion. Her face was pale, and she was clearly scared, a vulnerability Elias had rarely seen. He tried to offer comfort, to tell her it would be okay, but the words felt hollow and fake. He was a man who solved problems, and this was not a problem he could solve. Lena, however, moved to the bedside with an easy grace that was entirely her own. She didn't talk about doctors or tests or prognosis. She simply took Margaret's hand, her touch gentle but firm. "The bluebells are finally starting to bloom," she said, her voice a soft, melodic murmur. "I saw them this morning, just as the sun was coming up. They're a beautiful color, a blue that reminds me of the sky on a summer day." Elias watched, stunned, as his mother's tense posture seemed to relax. Lena's words were a lifeline, a connection to the world outside this cold room. She stayed for hours, long after her shift had ended, long after the visiting hours were over. The hospital staff, who had been stiff and formal with Elias, seemed to understand that Lena's presence was a part of Margaret's care. She told jokes, she recounted small, funny stories about her day, and she reminded Margaret of the things she had to live for. The garden, the books, the simple joy of a sunny afternoon. Elias, sitting in a chair in the corner, felt a profound, painful sense of inadequacy. He was the son, the one who was supposed to be the pillar of strength, yet he was a wreck, paralyzed by fear. It was Lena, the woman he had once observed with cold suspicion, who was providing the true comfort. He saw the bond between the two women, a bond that was forged not in shared blood or history, but in shared trust and compassion. He felt a deep, wrenching regret for all the years he had missed, all the moments he had prioritized business over family. He had built an empire, but Lena had built a sanctuary, and in this moment of crisis, her sanctuary was proving to be infinitely more valuable than his empire. As the night wore on and Margaret finally drifted off to sleep, Elias and Lena stood in the hallway. "She's going to be okay," Elias said, his voice raw with emotion. "The doctor said it was just a temporary episode." But he trailed off, unable to put into words the depth of his fear and his gratitude. "She's a fighter," Lena said, her gaze fixed on the hospital door. "She just needed to remember that she's still a part of the world." She turned to him, and in her eyes he saw not judgment, but a deep, empathetic understanding. "You were there, Elias. That's all she needed." He looked at her, this woman who had walked into his life and had, with a simple touch and a kind word, changed his world forever. He had brought her in as a subject of an observation, and she had become the only person he trusted. He was no longer a powerful CEO. He was just a terrified son, and Lena was his unexpected, indispensable ally. He knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with numbers or logic, that he was no longer alone in his struggle. The waiting room had been a place of torment and fear, but as the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sterile hospital walls in a soft, forgiving orange, it became a sanctuary. Margaret was stable and sleeping peacefully, her sudden health scare having been diagnosed as a temporary episode brought on by stress and exhaustion. Elias and Lena sat together in the quiet of the morning, the tension of the previous night slowly draining away. The frantic chaos of the hospital was gone, replaced by the hushed movements of the early morning staff. Elias's mind, once a storm of anxiety, had settled into a heavy, contemplative silence. He had faced his greatest fear, the loss of his mother, and in doing so, he had faced himself. He knew he had to speak, to confess, to lay bare the truth that had become an unbearable weight on his conscience. "Lena," he began, his voice rough and low, "I don't know what would have happened last night if you hadn't been here. For my mother, and for me. I was a wreck." He paused, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "Thank you. For everything." Lena simply nodded, her eyes fixed on the sunrise. Her presence was, as always, a profound source of calm. "You were there, Elias. That's what mattered. That's what she saw." Elias took a deep breath, the confession he had to make feeling like a physical object in his throat. He looked at Lena, a woman whose every action had been a lesson in humanity, a woman he had watched, judged, and ultimately, profoundly misunderstood. The shame was a bitter taste in his mouth. "There's something I have to tell you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "When I first saw you, helping my mother after her fall, I was suspicious. I didn't believe in what I was seeing. My world doesn't have people like you in it. People who are just kind for the sake of being kind." He swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. "I'm a man who needs to understand everything, to have every variable accounted for. I couldn't understand you, and it made me nervous." So, he trailed off, unable to meet her gaze. Lena waited patiently. She didn't press him. She just waited, her silent presence a sign that he could take his time, that he was safe. "I had cameras installed in the house," he finally forced out, his face burning with a mortifying heat. I watched you for weeks. I was looking for a motive, a reason for your kindness. I was trying to prove you were just like everyone else." He finally looked up at her, his eyes filled with a raw, painful shame. "I'm a man who builds empires on distrust, Lena. And I treated you like a variable in an equation. I'm so deeply sorry. For invading your privacy. For doubting your character. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong." He braced himself for the anger, for the hurt, for the righteous indignation that he knew he deserved. He expected her to stand up and walk away, to demand an apology he couldn't possibly give, to say things he couldn't bear to hear. But Lena's reaction was a profound and unexpected grace. A small, knowing smile played on her lips. She looked at him with an empathy so deep it made his heart ache. "I know," she said quietly. Elias's world tilted on its axis. You knew," he stammered, completely disarmed. "I felt it," she said. "Not the cameras, not a cold eye watching. I felt your presence. The way a mother can feel her child's gaze from across a room. At first, I didn't know what it was, but I knew someone was there. And I thought whoever was watching out of concern for your mother. I never felt fear. I just felt a deep, profound sadness. I felt that you were a son who was desperately trying to connect with his mother, but didn't know how. I trusted that, Elias. I trusted that underneath all of your anger and distrust, there was a man with a good heart who just needed to be reminded of what truly mattered." Her words were a torrent, washing away the shame he had been carrying for weeks. She wasn't just forgiving him. She was absolving him, not of his actions, but of the fear that had driven them. She had seen through his calculated defenses, his ruthless exterior, and had seen the terrified, heartbroken son beneath. He was speechless. He, a man who could talk for hours and persuade nations, was utterly speechless. He had been so wrong about her. She wasn't just a kind woman. She was a woman of immense wisdom and spiritual depth. She had turned his most shameful act into a moment of profound connection, and she had done it with a single, humbling truth. She had trusted his heart. He felt a deep, genuine sense of relief he had never known before. The weight was gone. The guilt was gone. And in its place was a new, powerful feeling. An overwhelming respect for this woman who had seen him at his worst and had still somehow seen the best in him. They sat in silence for a few more minutes, the sun now fully up, illuminating the new day. He had come here, to this moment of truth, expecting an end, a severance. Instead, he had found a new beginning. He realized that Lena had given him a gift no one else ever had. She had seen him. And with a simple act of profound trust, she had shown him the way to be seen. The broken vase, the garden, the hospital crisis, they had all led to this moment, a moment of unburdened honesty and a new, tentative hope. He was a different man walking out of that hospital, a man who had finally learned that the greatest strength was not in building walls, but in allowing them to fall. The day Margaret returned home from the hospital was a quiet celebration. The polished halls of the Vance estate, which had been so lifeless in her absence, now hummed with a renewed, gentle energy. Margaret herself was not only physically stronger, but imbued with a lightness of spirit that had been missing for years. The brush with mortality had paradoxically brought her to a new and deeper understanding of what truly mattered. She spent her days in the new garden, her hands gently tending to the soil, her face turned toward the sun. The garden was a physical monument to her recovery, a place of peace that had been born from a moment of crisis. Elias, watching her from the sunroom, felt a swell of profound gratitude. The fear and helplessness of the hospital had been replaced by a quiet, burgeoning hope. He knew his mother's recovery was not just a medical miracle. It was a testament to the unquantifiable power of genuine care. One afternoon, Margaret called him to her side, her face alight with a warm, sincere smile. "Elias," she began, her voice soft but firm. "I want you to know something. The doctors were good. The nurses were professional. But it was Lena who truly healed me." She took his hand, her gaze unflinching. "She was there for me. She talked to me not about my illness, but about the world outside. She reminded me that there was still life, still beauty. She made me want to get better, not because a doctor told me to, but because I wanted to be in this garden with her." Elias listened, the words settling into his heart with a profound weight. Her statement was a direct, irrefutable confirmation of what he had come to understand. All his wealth, all his power, all his professional care had paled in comparison to the simple, human presence of one woman. Lena hadn't just cleaned his mother's house. She had cleaned the clutter from her life, and in doing so, had shown Elias the true meaning of value. He realized that this was his moment of atonement, a chance to use his power not for profit, but for purpose. He had to help her. Not as a reward, not as a transaction, but as a partner in her vision. He requested a meeting with Lena the next day, a formal summons that felt both necessary and entirely out of place. He met her not in his office, but in the sunroom, the space where so much had changed. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow on the polished floors, and the air was scented with the faint perfume of the garden. He sat across from her, his posture still that of a CEO, but his eyes were filled with a genuine humility. "Lena," he began, his voice devoid of its usual professional cadence, "I've been thinking a great deal about what you told me, about your business idea, about Lena's helping hands." Lena's face showed a flicker of surprise, then a quiet, guarded hope. "It's still just a dream, Mr. Vance." "No," Elias said, a firm conviction in his tone. "It's not. It's a mission. And it's a mission I want to support." He leaned forward, his hands on the table, no longer a barrier between them, but a sign of his sincere engagement. "I'm not offering you a handout. That's not what you want, and that's not what this is. I'm offering you a partnership. I want to be your primary investor. I will provide all the capital you need to get started, to build an infrastructure, to hire and train a team." Lena's eyes widened, a rare look of astonishment on her composed face. "Mr. Vance, I don't know what to say. I don't have a formal business plan yet. I don't have anything to give you in return." Elias smiled, a genuine, unpracticed smile that reached his eyes. "You've already given me everything. You've shown me the value of empathy. You've taught me that people are more important than profit. I've spent my life building a business that prioritizes the bottom line. I want to help you build a business that prioritizes people. This isn't for a return on investment, Lena. This is for a return on humanity." He continued, his words flowing with a passionate urgency that was completely new to him. He laid out the resources he would provide: a team of lawyers to handle the legal filings, a business development expert to help her create a robust plan, a marketing team to build a brand around her vision. He wasn't just offering money. He was offering to be the silent engine behind her dream, giving her the power and the tools to make it a reality, but allowing her to be the sole face and heart of the company. Lena listened, her initial shock giving way to a thoughtful consideration. She was smart enough to know that a billionaire's offer was a double-edged sword. She had to be sure of his intentions. "You're doing this out of the goodness of your heart, Mr. Vance?" she asked, her voice laced with a gentle skepticism that was both fair and necessary. Elias met her gaze, his own eyes holding a new, raw honesty. "I'm doing this because you've shown me a better way to live. Because you've healed my mother in a way that all my money and power never could. I'm doing this because I believe in your vision more than I've ever believed in one of my own. I'm giving you the tools of my world so that you can create something truly meaningful in yours." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. Lena saw not the ruthless CEO, but the humbled son. She saw the man who had confessed his shame in a hospital waiting room. She saw the man who had built a garden out of a desire to connect. She saw that he was changed. She saw that his offer was not a transaction, but an act of redemption. A slow, peaceful smile spread across her face. "Then I would be honored to accept your partnership, Mr. Vance," she said. Elias felt a profound sense of relief and elation. He had closed deals worth billions without this feeling of genuine accomplishment. This was different. This wasn't about winning. This was about giving. He had used his wealth to build a garden, and now he was going to use it to build a dream. The path forward was clear, and for the first time in a long time, Elias Vance wasn't just planning for the future, he was hoping for it. The months that followed the partnership agreement between Elias Vance and Lena were a flurry of purposeful activity. Elias, true to his word, had been a silent engine of support, providing a team of lawyers and business consultants who worked seamlessly to turn Lena's dream into a tangible reality. But he never once interfered with her vision. Lena was the CEO, the face, and the heart of the company. She was a natural leader, and with the resources Elias provided, she created a business model that was as revolutionary as it was compassionate. Lena's Helping Hands was not just a service, it was a community. It offered fair wages, health benefits, and a mentorship program for its employees, empowering women who, like herself, sought dignified work and a chance to build a better life. The day of the grand opening was a beautiful, crisp autumn morning. The office, located in a bustling but accessible neighborhood, was a reflection of Lena's values. It was warm, inviting, and filled with light, a stark contrast to the cold, impersonal corporate spaces Elias was used to. There was no opulent ribbon cutting, no champagne tower. Instead, the celebration was a community gathering filled with warmth and genuine joy. Women from the neighborhood, family members of the new employees, and local business owners milled about, their faces alight with a shared sense of hope. Elias arrived with Margaret, who was beaming, her face full of a quiet, profound pride. She moved through the room slowly but with a newfound strength, her hand resting on Elias's arm, greeting the employees with a kindness that came from a place of deep personal experience. For her, this was more than a business. It was a tribute to the woman who had helped her find her own strength again. She was the company's first and most important success story. Elias stood back, a glass of sparkling cider in his hand, a quiet observer of the scene. He saw Lena in her element. She moved through the room with a confident grace, her smile warm and genuine as she spoke to each of her new employees. He saw the women who had been hired. Some were single mothers, some were immigrants, all were seeking an opportunity, and he saw the light in their eyes. The fear and exhaustion that had once defined their faces were replaced with a look of hope and respect. He listened as one of the new employees, a woman named Maria, told a small group about the training program. "Lena doesn't just teach us how to clean," Maria said, her voice full of emotion. "She teaches us how to be a professional. She taught me that what I do matters. She gave me my dignity back." Elias felt a profound sense of awe. He had closed billion-dollar deals that had reshaped markets and made headlines. He had stood on stages and accepted awards. But none of those moments had ever given him the feeling that this simple, honest scene was giving him. He had spent a lifetime chasing the thrill of acquisition and profit, a feeling that was sharp and fleeting. But this was a deep, resonant hum of genuine purpose. He realized that the happiness on Maria's face was a far more valuable return on investment than any financial gain he had ever chased. The room grew quiet as Lena stood on a small platform. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice, calm and clear, commanded the room with a natural authority. She spoke not of business plans or projections, but of her journey. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her gaze sweeping across the room. Lena's Helping Hands started not as a business idea, but as a simple belief that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. "I learned this from my grandmother, and I learned it from a woman who taught me that what matters most is the heart, not the value of the things around us." She paused, her eyes finding Elias and Margaret in the crowd, a warm, knowing smile on her face. "This company is for every woman who wants to build a better life for herself and her family. It is for every person who wants to be seen, not just as a job to be done, but as a human to be valued. This is for all of us." Her speech was met with a thunderous applause that was not just for the success of a new company, but for the success of a new way of doing business. As the crowd began to mingle again, Elias felt a hand on his arm. It was Margaret. "Look at her," Margaret whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "She did it. She took a tiny seed of an idea, and she made it into this. She saved me, Elias. And in a way," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur, "I think she saved you too." Elias, looking at Lena, who was now surrounded by her happy, hopeful employees, felt a raw, emotional truth settle over him. His mother was right. He had entered this journey as a man who could only see people in terms of their utility, their value, their transactional nature. He had tried to own the world, but in doing so, he had lost himself. Lena had not just changed his mother's life. She had given him a purpose beyond profit, a reason to be a better man. He realized that the greatest deal he had ever closed was the one he made with Lena, not for a financial gain, but for the chance to be a part of something truly meaningful. He walked over to Lena, Margaret by his side. They stood there, a small, unlikely family united by an even more unlikely chain of events. He didn't say anything to Lena. He didn't have to. He just met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw not the calculating CEO, but the humble partner, the grateful son, and the hopeful man who was finally learning how to live. Years passed, and the fleeting moments of a hospital waiting room and a newly built garden blossomed into a lifetime. The story of Elias Vance, the ruthless billionaire, and Lena, the compassionate cleaning woman, was no longer a moment of crisis, but a foundational chapter in a new and unexpected reality. The world, which had once seemed so predictable to Elias, was now filled with a warmth and purpose he had never known. Lena's helping hands had flourished, growing from a small, hopeful startup into a thriving, respected enterprise. With Elias's initial investment and her unwavering dedication, the company had become a beacon in the community. It had not only expanded its services, but had also created a powerful network of support for its employees. Women who had once struggled to make ends meet now had stable careers, mentorship, and a sense of belonging. The success of the business wasn't measured in its revenue, but in the countless lives it had changed, in the confidence it had restored, and in the families it had lifted up. Lena was a CEO in her own right, her leadership style a beautiful inversion of the corporate world Elias had once inhabited. She led with empathy, not with fear, and her company's success was a direct result of her profound belief that when you invest in people, they give you a return far greater than any financial gain. Elias, for his part, had undergone a seismic, permanent shift. The man who had once treated every person as a pawn in a larger game was now a CEO driven by a new kind of purpose. Vance Industries, under his guidance, had moved away from its cold, predatory practices. They began to invest in sustainable community projects, to fund scholarships for underprivileged students, and to create a company culture that valued the mental health and well-being of its employees. Elias's public image, once defined by his ruthless ambition, was slowly being redefined by his quiet, effective compassion. He was still a titan of industry, but he was a titan with a conscience, and he found an immense, soul-deep satisfaction in using his power not to acquire, but to empower. And at the center of this new world was Margaret. She was thriving, her health and spirit a testament to the power of a life filled with purpose and connection. The garden, which had been the first step in her healing, was now a riot of color and life, a living tapestry of her days. She spent her mornings tending to her flowers, her afternoons reading old books, and her evenings with her son and Lena, her heart filled with a contentment she had once thought was lost to her forever. Her relationship with Elias was open and loving, filled with an easy affection that had been absent for so long. She saw in him not just her son, but the man he had become, a man who was finally truly happy. The friendship between Elias and Lena was the most unexpected and most beautiful part of the story. They were an unlikely pair, a billionaire and a former cleaning woman, united not by a shared background, but by a shared purpose. They spoke every week, their conversations a comfortable blend of business and personal life. They had a bond that was built on honesty, vulnerability, and a profound mutual respect. Elias had found in Lena a confidant and a moral compass, a person who could challenge him without fear and guide him without judgment. Lena, in turn, had found in Elias a true friend and a partner who believed in her dream with an unwavering faith. They had become, in every sense of the word, family. The story culminates on a warm autumn evening, years after the grand opening. The setting sun cast a golden light over the Vance estate, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak trees. Elias, Lena, and Margaret were sitting together in the garden, the space that held so much of their shared history. Margaret was in her favorite chair, her face peaceful as she looked at the blooming flowers. Elias and Lena were on a bench nearby, talking quietly, their voices low and easy. There was no pretense, no formality. There was just a shared silence, a profound sense of peace that had been so hard-won. Elias looked at his mother, her face radiant with a happiness that was once an abstract concept to him. He looked at Lena, a successful entrepreneur whose grace and wisdom had changed his life forever. He looked at the garden, a physical symbol of a love and connection he had been too blind to see. He had once believed that wealth and power were the measures of a man, that control was the only way to navigate a chaotic world. But in the quiet calm of this moment, surrounded by the two women who had saved him, he knew that the greatest wealth he possessed was not in his bank account, but in the love and connection he had found in this small, unexpected family. He had learned that a broken vase was just a thing. A broken heart was what truly mattered. And with the help of a quiet, compassionate woman, he had learned how to fix it. The sun finally set, and the three of them sat in the twilight, a beautiful, unconventional family, a testament to the idea that some of the most profound connections in life are forged not by blood, but by a simple, unwavering act of kindness.